Good morning, everybody. Welcome to BSides. Very happy to be back in person. I have a few little things to announce. First of all, I want to say thank you to our sponsors, specifically Diamond sponsor, LastPass and Palo Alto Networks. Also the Gold sponsor, just to name a few, Amazon, Envision, and Blue Cat. Second, a couple of housekeeping things. Please silence your cell phones. The talk is being recorded and streamed, so we want this to be clean and also as a respect for our presenters. If you have questions when we have the Q&A at the end, please come back to the front so the presenter can hear and repeat for the people we are streaming to. BSide has a very strict picture-taking policy. You're probably aware of that, so don't take any picture without the explicit consent of anybody in the frame. And I think I'm probably done with the housekeeping, except keep your mask all time. Now, let me introduce Matt. Matt is going to talk about malware families, anti-forensic, and some botnets, I guess. So, Matt, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone. So, hello and welcome to my talk, A Tale of Two Malware Families, Overcoming Anti-Forensics and Foiling Botnets in the Cloud. So let's kick off with some formalities before we get started on the content for today. So first of all, I'm Matt Muir, and I'm a threat intelligence researcher at Kado Security. Prior to working at Kado, I was a macOS malware researcher, and I've got a background in DevOps, digital forensics, and operational cybersecurity. So you can follow me on Twitter at the handle on screen, and I'll share the slides after the talk, unless BSides do that for me, of course. So as part of Kado Labs, Kado's threat research team, I'm regularly involved in conducting research into new software threats affecting cloud infrastructure. As the name of the talk suggests, I'm here today to talk to you about two recent malware families we've been tracking, both of which exhibit some interesting anti-forensics or detection evasion techniques. So without further ado, I'll first go over the agenda of the talk before diving into some real-life examples of cloud malware we've seen in the wild. So I'll kick off this presentation by introducing you to what we call the cloud challenge. Next, I'll move on to the first malware family, Stomp. As we'll see, Stomp is a cloud-native malware campaign that exhibits some interesting detection evasion techniques. Following that, I'll discuss ABCbot, a botnet initially discovered by NetLab 360 that we've been tracking since 2021 and has a longer history than we first realized. Finally, we'll wrap up with some highlights of a more recent cloud-native campaign, give you some tips for detecting this type of behavior in your environment, and finish off with some further reading before the Q&A session. So I'd like to begin by giving a brief overview of something we call the cloud challenge. Despite a sustained migration to the cloud from companies across the globe, organizations are increasingly susceptible to attacks which are advancing in both severity and in sophistication. Recent cloud-focused malware campaigns have demonstrated that adversary groups possess an intimate knowledge of cloud technologies and their security mechanisms. And not only that, but they're using this to their advantage. Cloud compute environments remain an obvious target for such groups. However, we're now also beginning to see a shift of focus towards serverless computing and containers. On top of this, the ease of which cloud resources can be compromised has led to adversary groups competing over potential targets. So unfortunately, defenders haven't adapted at the same pace. There are a number of reasons for this, with visibility into cloud infrastructure being a commonly cited one. But it's an unavoidable fact that the campaigns I'm going to cover are both successful in achieving their objectives and are widespread. Clearly, attackers in the cloud space are utilizing this to their advantage by employing TTPs aimed at evading detection, foiling attribution, and covering their tracks. So this leads me to this slide, which I stole from my colleague Chris, who did a similar talk recently at Forward CloudSec. Most cloud threat actors see themselves as the GIF on the left, or as Chris Hemsworth in the movie Black Hat, which is a great movie, of course. However, despite the cloud being a lucrative and easily exploitable target for many threat groups, the reality is that most cyber attacks on cloud infrastructure are not hugely technical. Ultimately, when it comes to technical resource, this means that most cloud threat actors actually have more in common with Homer on the GIF to the right. So what we'll see throughout this talk is that although the tools are rudimentary, so most payloads are shell scripts, for example, the developers make use of some nifty tricks and Linux-specific knowledge to evade detection. So the first of two malware families I'm going to discuss today is what we refer to as Coinstar. Coinstar is a cloud-native malware campaign that we've been tracking since early 2022, and it was notable for its anti-hardening and detection evasion techniques. So to give everyone a quick overview of this family, Coinstar is a cryptojacking malware campaign which exploits resources hosted primarily by Asian cloud service providers. So for example, Tencent and Alibaba Cloud. There have been a couple of theories about why these CSPs are specifically targeted by this campaign. It could be the case that it's simply due to the location of the attackers and familiarity with the CSPs in their region. I suspect that since many of these CSPs are newer than, for example, AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure, the security controls that are in place are perhaps not as mature as other cloud service providers, making it more likely that instances and resources will be deployed in an insecure fashion. If anyone has done research on this specifically, then please get in touch with me as I'd like to know more about it. So if you're someone that follows cloud security research, you're probably bored to death at this point by a family of cryptojacking shell scripts. But with Coinstar, we noticed some interesting techniques which hint at the attacker's awareness of cloud security measures and the incident response process. So these included the use of timestamp manipulation, otherwise known as time stomping, an attempt to remove system cryptographic policies in order to weaken the target system, C2 communication via a reverse shell, and a reference to a prior cryptojacking campaign, potentially in an attempt to foil attribution. So now with the overview out of the way, let's have a deeper look at the malware itself and the payloads that it utilised. So the first thing that caught our eye when analysing a Coinstar payload was the presence of this date-time string, which you can see passed in as a parameter to the touch command's -t option. Hopefully you all actually can see that okay, but I've highlighted the relevant section in the screenshot. So the function on screen begins with an existence check for user bin mod user. If this isn't found, the script then greps for a sequence of strings found in the chmod binary in a subshell and uses grep's -l option to return the file name only. This can be seen on line 16 here. It then renames the chmod binary to mod user and runs the touch command with -t and a datetime string of 2223 on the 20th of May 2019. In hindsight, that's a lot of consecutive 20s for a live talk. So this may be common knowledge to most people in the room, but after consulting the touch command's man page, we realized that this is, of course, a pretty neat way to perform time stomping with a command that's virtually ubiquitous across Unix-like systems. On line 21, we see the exact same technique employed for the chatter or change attributes command, except this time with a slightly different datetime string. So why are the threat actors, in this case, obfuscating usage of chatter and chmod in the first place? Of course, both of these commands are specific to file access control. Most cloud-native malware campaigns assume that certain files of interest will be restricted for editing, either via file attributes or permissions. So using the chmod and chatter commands to modify these permissions or attributes is, of course, the most obvious way to overcome this. This is why we see this in virtually all malicious shell scripts that we analyze at Kado. So clearly, this is a creative example of living off the land to obfuscate system utilities typically leveraged in cloud malware campaigns. But how successful actually is it? Well, out of interest, and since my employer happens to develop an incident response platform, we decided to run these commands in a test machine and import an image of it into Kado to see how this would look to an incident responder. So as you can see on the highlighted portion of the slide, Kado identified a disparity between the timestamps of both the mod user and ch user files. It seems like the touch command updated both the modified and access timestamps to the datetime hard-coded in the shell script. However, most importantly for us as defenders or responders, the created time was still correct. It seemed likely that this was an attempt to obfuscate usage of the chatter and chmod command line tools, as some forensics tools may prioritize files recently accessed or executed when building a timeline of events. Using a copy of these system binaries also avoids alerting admins who may have set up monitoring for execution of these utilities. So you might be thinking that using touch for time stomping is not particularly novel or technically advanced. However, this following technique we've yet to see in other campaigns. So this seemingly innocuous one-liner that we can see on the slide here, residing at line 23 of the same script we saw the time stomping behavior, actually has some pretty interesting stuff going on. First of all, RM is used to remove all files or subdirectories within user share, which have the string crypto in the name. So this, of course, sounded quite interesting to us as malware analysts. So we had a look at what might be stored under such a directory in various Linux distributions. This led us to discover that in RHEL and RHEL-like distributions, it's possible to define a system-wide cryptographic policy which is stored in config files under user share crypto-policies. These policies allow or deny application-level usage of certain cryptographic protocols dependent on the user's risk posture. So for example, American federal institutions are required to deploy computing systems which conform to FIPS 140-2. And there's a FIPS-specific policy bundled with RHEL to help enforce this. Clearly, this is an attempt by the malware developer to weaken the system by removing such policies. In order to enforce the cryptographic policies in the first place, a process named crypto is used, which interfaces with the Linux kernel crypto API. To ensure that the policies are indeed removed from the system and no longer enforced, the malware then goes ahead and kills the crypto process after removing the config files. So this is something that wasn't really picked up on when we first published about this threat, but I think that it's particularly interesting. So if anyone else has seen this, then please let me know, as I'd be interested to discuss it. So this was another interesting and very Linuxy technique employed by Coinstar for the purposes of evading detection. So as I'm sure you'll know, most Linux distributions support read-write operations to a remote host via the dev TCP device file. Naturally, this is an easy and natively supported way of creating a reverse shell or C2 communications channel. So as we can see on screen here, the function curl is used to retrieve payloads and communicate information about the state of the system back to a C2 server. Line 4 establishes communication with this server over port 443, the port typically associated with HTTPS traffic. We looked the IP of the remote server up in Shodan and saw that the server was running Python's simple HTTP server module. So this suggests that although the traffic was going over port 443, the traffic itself wasn't actually encrypted. So clearly this wouldn't fool anyone with robust traffic monitoring in place. But we suspect that it was an attempt to ensure that C2 communications passed freely, as it's unlikely that 443 outbound would be blocked by firewalls in the target environment. So we observed this function being invoked on a regular basis throughout the Coinstar payloads. Usually, invocation would occur after file existence checks used to determine whether it was necessary to retrieve additional payloads. This makes this a stealthy way for the attackers to register additional implants. So this was an interesting and unexpected finding when analysing some more of the Coinstar payloads. Coinstar made use of cron as a persistence mechanism and registered a cron job under the root user. However, rather than using this persistence to launch or relaunch malicious payloads, as most malware would, Coinstar instead used the cron job to kill the tail and mass scan utilities, the latter of which is often used in these types of campaigns to find vulnerable servers to target. So we noticed an interested commented line in the cron job, which you may be able to make out on line 243 there. At one point, it seems as if the code hosting service Anon Pasta was used to host an additional payload for the Coinstar campaign. We can see on line 243 that the URL for this provider is still added to the cron job, but it's commented out, resulting in it having no effect on the job itself. When we visited the URL, we found another URL pointing to the Anon DNS, anonymous DNS provider. So this URL contained a number of strings that we recognized from a prior campaign. The first of which was Xanthe, a crypto mining campaign discovered by Cisco Talos that we'll come back to later in the talk. Furthermore, one of the payloads in the Xanthe campaign that we'd analysed was called FCYZO, same as the resource in the URL here. Unfortunately, the URL was down when we attempted to retrieve this payload, so we couldn't determine whether it was the exact same installation script as we'd seen in the Xanthe campaign. We also didn't notice any overlap of infrastructure between these campaigns or anything else that would suggest they were linked. So this led us to conclude that the URL likely contained those names in an attempt to foil attribution. So finally, to round off our overview of Coinstar, we noticed this rather amusing spelling mistake when statically analysing the custom version of XMRig that the Coinstar scripts drop. So we're not sure if this is deliberate or not, but it was jokingly suggested that it could be a reference to British crime actor Jason Statham, who may well have had some involvement in this campaign. So I'm not sure if everyone here will know him or not, but I've included a photo of him on the next slide for visual reference. So now we've covered our first malware family, I'm going to move on to another cloud-native campaign named ABCbot that we've been tracking since late 2021. To give a quick overview of this family, similar to Coinstar, ABCbot is a botnet which is spread via initialization shell scripts and targets Asian CSPs such as Tencent, Baidu, and Alibaba Cloud. So the malware includes payloads consisting of shell scripts and ELF executables, with the shell scripts in particular displaying some notable capabilities. These capabilities include insertion of attacker-controlled SSH keys to maintain access to the target system, self-propagation in a worm-like fashion, using information about cloud security services and competing malware campaigns to disable competitors, and registration of persistence via common Linux persistence techniques. So the campaign was originally reported on in November 2021 by NetLab 360. NetLab 360 focused their analysis on the ELF payloads used to connect the infected machine to the botnet. I've included a reference to their research at the end of the talk if you'd like to know more about this. So for this reason, we won't cover the botnet-related payloads today. Instead, we'll cover one of the installation shell scripts used to propagate the malware and download additional payloads. We believe this script reveals more about the attacker's capabilities and objectives, since the botnet payload was based on open source code. In fitting with the theme of this talk, the attacker's knowledge of the cloud environments which their campaign targets was also evident in this shell script. So let's begin by taking a look at an interesting capability displayed by the ABC bot malware family, the killing of competitors, although fortunately not in a literal sense. So one thing that is immediately clear from analysing this initialization script is that the developers behind ABC bot are really invested in killing off competing miners and cryptojacking campaigns. The function that you can see on screen here, which is several hundred lines long, is dedicated to removing artifacts of competing malware campaigns and mining software such as XMRig. So we also observed the malware searching for processes associated with other prominent Linux malware campaigns. So for example, things like Watchdog and Kinsing. This suggests that those behind ABCbot actively maintain a working knowledge of the cloud security threat landscape. In a similar vein, the malware also searches for malicious Docker images and removes or kills the containers as appropriate. So this strongly suggests that ABCbot relies on exploitation of misconfigured Docker API endpoints for propagation, which is of course a common infection vector in cloud environments and utilized by many cloud native campaigns. So clearly, the ABCbot developers had invested significant time into researching cloud security threats, given the previous slide. However, not only that, but the developers also demonstrated a knowledge of cloud security mechanisms as disabling of security services native to the CSPs targeted was performed. So this, of course, allowed their malware to execute unimpeded and also allows us as analysts to determine the targets of the campaign. For example, several lines were dedicated to killing processes associated with the Alibaba and Tencent cloud security agents, as we can see on screen here. Similarly, the uninstallation scripts, often baked into instances hosted by these CSPs, were used to completely uninstall monitoring software in some instances. The ease of which these monitoring tools can be removed could well be another reason as to why these CSPs in particular were targeted. So we'll move on now to look at some methods of maintaining access employed by ABCbot. A key objective of most malware campaigns is to establish network connectivity to allow bidirectional communication with the attacker. This is, of course, known as command and control. We saw this in our coverage of Coinstar and its use of a dev TCP reverse shell. In a function named IP tables checker, the developer behind ABCbot configures the Linux IP tables firewall to drop or accept traffic based on port numbers and source IP addresses. This particular function gave us some insights into the state of this campaign at the time of analysis. So for example, it's clear from the function that the malware is under active development, as the author has left plenty of commented code. In one of the commented rules, it appears as if the developer configured IP tables to accept all ingress traffic from a remote IP. This was likely a C2 server under the attacker's control. So another commented rule drops ingress traffic from ports 2375 and 2376. Of course, as we all know, these ports are typically associated with the Docker Engine API. We suspect that this was added at one point to prevent attempts to halt execution of any malicious Docker containers the malware creates. A check is also done to see whether these rules are already in place, but if they aren't, they are no longer added. Instead, a more generic rule is added to allow all ingress traffic to a non-standard port number of 26800. Interestingly, URLs embedded in the malware also made use of this port. So another notable technique of ABCbot was the ability to infect related hosts with a copy of itself. Firstly, the malware removes SSH keys found on the host, which appear to be from similar attacks. It then goes ahead and inserts its own SSH key to guarantee ongoing access to the host. After this, as we can see on the slide here, the malware checks for the existence of root's SSH known host file and a corresponding public key. If these files are found in root's SSH directory, known hosts are enumerated in a loop, and a copy of the installation script is run on each of the remote hosts found. This ensures propagation of the malware in a worm-like fashion and could result in an organization's entire cloud estate being rapidly compromised. So now that we've covered some of the notable capabilities of ABCbot, let's discuss an unexpected finding that emerged during analysis of the campaign. When analysing ABCbot, we were initially under the impression that we were analysing a relatively new malware family. Continued analysis revealed that this malware had a longer history than we initially thought. So back in late 2020, Cisco's Talos security research team reported on an emerging cloud cryptojacking malware campaign that they named Xanthi. Xanthi was originally discovered after an intrusion was found on one of Talos Docker honeypots. So we discovered a link between ABCbot and Xanthi when conducting analysis on the infrastructure behind the ABCbot campaign. Once we began comparing samples from both campaigns, similarities in features and capabilities began to emerge. Additional comparison of the code used in samples in both campaigns further confirmed our suspicions. So before discussing the similarities between these families, let's have an overview of Xanthi itself. Xanthi is a family of cryptojacking malware with the primary objective of hijacking system resources to mine the Monero cryptocurrency. In order to mine Monero on target systems, the common open source miner XMRig is deployed. So similar to ABCbot, Xanthi also spreads via exposed Docker API endpoints, with an initialization shell script responsible for propagation, network scanning, and downloading of additional payloads. Xanthi's additional payloads included an open source library for hiding processes, a script to disable security services and kill competing miners, and the XMRig binary itself. So if you were paying attention to the previous section of this talk, then this will probably sound familiar to you. So let's take a look at some of the signs that demonstrated these campaigns were linked. In their report published in late 2020, Talos researchers commented on the coding style present in the Xanthi scripts they analysed. They highlighted that in the samples analysed, function declarations were located at the top of the script, and function invocation was conducted at the bottom. Talos suggested that this likely aided testing of new iterations, with function calls commented or uncommented as necessary. So although this is, of course, a fairly tenuous link, it's interesting to note that samples from the ABC bot and Zante campaigns both followed this convention. So diving deeper into the samples themselves, we see several of the functions in Zante have an identical name to those in ABC bot. Some of the functions also have the string go appended to the end of their names. And this is another convention that we observed in both campaigns. So we identified 5 functions with identical naming that you can see on the slide here. Subsequent analysis of each of the above functions was performed, and they were determined to be semantically equivalent. So these functions were mainly responsible for adding public DNS servers to resolve.conf to ensure outbound DNS requests could be made, registering persistence via cron and RC scripts, creating and modifying IP tables rules, as we saw earlier in our analysis of ABC bot, and downloading of additional payloads, such as those used to connect the machine to the botnet in ABC bot's case, and the downloading of XMRig in Zante's case. So we mentioned earlier that propagation via enumeration of known hosts was a notable capability of ABC bot. This exact same technique was used in the samples of Zante we analysed, albeit with a slightly different implementation. Examples of the code responsible from both campaigns can be seen on the slide. Similarly, in ABC bot, a number of malicious users were added to the system to facilitate a backdoor. The users added to the system were identical in samples from both campaigns and included usernames such as logger, sysall, system, and auto-updater. Both ABCbot and Zante searched for and removed hard-coded users. When analysing ABCbot, we originally believed that the usernames being searched for were from competing campaigns. However, we now believe that at least one of the usernames searched for by ABCbot was from a historical campaign from this threat actor. The username in question was opsec_x12, and both ABCbot and Zante included code to remove this user. When we first analysed samples from Zante, we realised that this username was being displayed as ASCII art at the top of one of the payloads. So while this could, of course, be an attempt by one threat actor to copy another, we believed that our prior findings indicated that this was more than coincidental. So now on to our final and most interesting finding. Although each of the similarities we've discussed were enough to give us reasonable suspicion that these campaigns were linked, we still had some doubts. So code reuse is of course common amongst malware developers, and with payloads such as shell scripts, where everything is in plain text, copying is even more likely. So in light of this, we needed one final piece of evidence to conclusively link the campaigns. We already discussed a function from ABCbot named IPTablesChecker, which was responsible for configuring IP tables to allow ingress traffic from a non-standard port. An incredibly similar version of this function was also found in the Zante sample we analysed. Not only that, but rules used within this function to allow traffic from the C2 server included the exact same IP address in both Zante and in ABCbot. So the lines from payloads in both campaigns that demonstrate this are viewable on screen. So to us, this constituted an overlap of infrastructure, which was fairly strong proof that the campaigns were linked. The server at the hard-coded IP address would have to be under the control of the developer behind both ABCbot and Zante for it to be usefully included in the script. Of course, there would be little reason for the developer to include this if it wasn't a part of their own infrastructure. So we believe that this is the strongest indicator yet that these campaigns are linked and that the same threat actor is responsible. So in summary, the ABC bot and Xanthi campaigns demonstrated the sophistication of malware developers in the cloud security space. Although code reuse is common in malware, particularly malware involving shell scripts, we've highlighted an overlap in infrastructure and identified reuse of unique strings which would be difficult and/or pointless for someone to copy. If the same threat actor is behind these campaigns, we believe that this indicates a shift away from cryptocurrency mining, which is of course a common objective of cloud malware and the main objective of Xanthi, onto potentially more destructive botnet activities, as we highlighted with ABC bot. So this should give you some idea of the destructive potential of cloud threat actors, if they decide to broaden their horizons from cryptojacking, that is. So I know that the title of this talk is A Tale of Two Malware Families, but since the two families discussed in the talk are relatively old now, I wanted to include an example of something recent which fits with the theme of the talk. I also thought it would be a good idea to give some tips to defenders who may be concerned about preventing or detecting this type of threat in their environment. So this snippet is from a recent campaign from the threat actor Watchdog who targeted our honeypot infrastructure. It utilizes a similar time stomping technique as we saw in the overview of Coinstar, but, and perhaps more interestingly, we can see the attackers implementing a very rudimentary, albeit effective process hider. First, the binary for PS is copied to another file named PS Lanagiro. A very simple shell script is then written to bin PS, the sole purpose of which is to call the renamed PS binary and pipe the output through an inverse grep to filter out processes with the strings DDNS and scan in the name. So as you might expect from this, DDNS and scan are two malicious processes run by the malware. Amazingly, this actually works, and it's perhaps the most Unixy process hider I've ever seen in my life. So more importantly, this demonstrates that you don't need fancy rootkits to have effective detection evasion. So this was another simple but very effective technique employed by Watchdog for hiding artifacts on the target system. So when analysing their payloads, we saw multiple references to paths containing directories that were named with 3 full stops or an ellipsis. So it turns out that this name is perfectly valid for files and directories on Linux systems and has the added benefit of looking similar to the 2-dot alias for the parent directory in long listings. So as you can see on the screen here, the ellipsis directory is hidden and could easily be mistaken for the parent directory by an unsuspecting admin. Obviously, this wouldn't fool proper EDR solutions, but in cloud compute instances or containers, where you may be manually investigating a breach, this is the kind of thing that could be easily overlooked. So we briefly touched on this technique when we discussed Coinstar, but it's one that seems to be a favourite amongst cloud threat actors. In this screenshot, we can see existence checks for a file named CD1. This is actually a version of curl that's been renamed in order to obfuscate its usage. The malware then sets an envar with the path to the renamed version of curl so that any attempts to retrieve additional payloads make use of CD1 and not the curl binary itself. It's difficult to see just how effective this would be, but I suppose if you're monitoring for invocations of curl, then it's a way for the attacker to avoid generating an alert. This technique has also been observed when obfuscating usage of other data transfer utilities, so for example, wget. Not only that, but we've observed it being utilised in campaigns from Watchdog, Rock Group, Team TNT, and so on. So moving on now to some tips for anyone fortunate enough to have to defend against these types of attacks. So first things first, make sure you have the basics covered. Remember, cloud threat actors don't typically make use of advanced 0 days or nation-state level tooling. Although their attacks are increasing in sophistication, they still have more in common with Homer than they do with Chris Hemsworth in Black Hat. So in terms of basics, ensure that you've got proper auditing in place in your hosts or containers, and you're not exposing services to the internet unnecessarily. Of course, Docker and Redis are still some of the most common infection vectors in cloud attacks. We actually got an idea of how common it is to exploit these services when we deployed a Docker honeypot that was first compromised only 12 minutes after we put it up. So watch for new additions to user bin or bin directories. Both campaigns described today relied upon the renaming of binaries under these directories to evade detection. If you monitor for writes to user bin or bin, you'll easily be able to identify when this occurs and trace the usage of the renamed utilities. So thirdly, implement a Bastion host. Most people probably know to do this already, but cloud threat actors rely heavily on SSH propagation. So if you have a known host file on your host with IPs of all the other hosts in your organization, this ensures rapid compromise of your cloud estate if you're targeted by some of these campaigns. So ensure adequate CSP logging is in place. This is of course an obvious one, but it comes up all the time. Cloud malware campaigns are successful partly due to misconfigurations in cloud environments, but also largely due to the lack of visibility that defenders have into resources in their estate. A comprehensive CSP logging strategy can help with this. So finally, monitor for execution of the touch binary. Using touch to modify timestamps on a file isn't, of course, an everyday occurrence. If you see execution of touch, particularly when combined with the -T or D options, then it's a good indication that something strange is going on. So I'd like to wrap up now with a note that incident response in the cloud is hard, and that hopefully this has given you some knowledge of techniques currently in use by cloud native threat actors. If you're interested in this type of thing, here are a list of references that we used when conducting this research. So as you can see here, there are blogs from NetLab 360, Talos, Unit 42, etc. These organizations are all well worth following if you're a fan of cloud security research or you work in this area. I've also included the blogs that we published which detail this research, and you can find many more on the blog section of our website at cadosecurity.com/blogs. So I hope that you all enjoyed the talk and have some idea of the techniques currently used by cloud threat actors. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'll post the slides afterwards if BSides don't do it first. And please feel free to reach out to me if you want to discuss any of this further. So I can be reached at mmuir@cadosecurity.com or Matt Muir on Twitter. So I think we've got some time for a Q&A session now. So if you have any questions about cloud security or the content in the talk, then please let me know. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all around Vegas for the rest of Black Hat and DEF CON. So they won't be on the blog, but I can post them publicly. I'll post them on Twitter after the talk. Most of the screenshots that were used in the slides come from the blogs, so if you're interested in that, then check those out. Yes?
Did your team do any financial analysis of how much Monero was mined by these hackers?
Yeah, so you're not actually the first person to ask me this. We didn't actually do that, but it's something that we probably will look into in future. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I feel like it's an important piece of the puzzle, but not as interesting as how they did it.
Yeah. I mean, my background's in malware analysis, so my focus really is on the payloads itself quite often. But yeah, I would agree that it's definitely a key part of the puzzle. Any more questions at all? Cool. Thank you.